The death of Tubman after 27 years of his dictatorial rule and the advancement of Vice President Talbot to the presidency heightened expectations that there will be more democratic and participatory government, respect for the rule of law, and greater individual freedoms. President Talbot himself encouraged this expectation, first by the slogans he introduced: total involvement, mat to mattress, moving on to higher heights. And by the way he dressed. He wore the safari suit, popularized it, such that you can say it almost became our national dress. More importantly, and more important than the expectations that were raised, was the fact that Liberia had changed. We had entered a new epoch and we did not know it. The fruits of the limited social policies, especially the educational programs of the late 50s and 60s, when Liberia had access to a lot of iron ore money, the fruits of the economic boom of that period had reached maturity. The demands for participation in the political and developmental processes would now become great and could not be postponed. The time for change was upon Liberia. And President Talbot nurtured this change in many ways. His developmental agenda was progressive, and he accomplished very many achievements. He quickly earned the name Speedy for the pace at which he sought to move our development initiatives. Progress on his development agenda was remarkable. He loosened up the society, replaced an environment of terror with one of free speech. He expanded the physical infrastructure of our country, highways, and especially farm-to-market roads. Our agriculture was reinvigorated. Pipe-borne water and electricity were taken to our counties and major cities in our country. He encouraged the enlistment of the talents of Liberian professionals, especially those from indigenous backgrounds. Liberia seemed to be turning the corner in its development processes under President Talbot. With the development agenda, President Talbot sought to put in place a system of administrative deconcentration that would support the efforts to expand the benefits of top-down government to the villages of Liberia. Some of us remember the work of the Rural Development Task Force, which was instrumental under the leadership of Dr. Cyril Bright to frame an approach to decentralization in our country. Unfortunately, that policy remained at the level of deconcentration by the time of the coup. In regional politics and regional relationships and in international affairs, President Talbot brought us closer to our neighbors in what we could today call a result-oriented relationship. He worked to establish ECOWAS and the Mano River Union. And at the international level, he sought to diversify Liberia's international relations breaking a childlike relationship that we had always maintained with the United States. In fact, in some of our writings, our people refer to Liberia as a stepchild. This is how we had seen ourselves in this relationship. Talbot dared to diversify our relationship, and this was very important. But the greatest dilemma that President Talbot faced, in my view, was the government's inability to respond sufficiently to the demands for more democratic participation in government. It was time for a paradigm shift from an oligarchical form of government to a more inclusive, transparent, and accountable form of government. The shift in the perceptions and expectations of government by a new generation did not seem to have been identified, let alone appreciated by the leaders of the day. Pressures for democratic change were met either by the offering of patronage or by threats of punishment, and both were frequently resisted. Let me talk about some of these dilemmas a bit more specifically. The first dilemma President Talbot faced was an ideological dilemma. Which way the country would go. President Talbot seemed to have struggled to mediate, on the one hand, the demands for change that was pressed upon him by a more youthful generation and by the oligarchy's demand for continuity and its members' fears and insecurities. Now, by a youthful generation, I mean the full range of emerging national actors that included student leaders, labor leaders, business leaders, especially those in the Liberian Business Caucus, the newly emerging political leaders, including emerging leaders in the Truitt Party. There was in the Truitt Party, if you will, a left wing, people who wanted change. And then there were people from Moja, like myself. And there were others in the Progressive Alliance of Liberia and associated groups, the Revelation, the newspaper. So there was no monopoly of views. And Talbot had created an environment in which all views could be heard. There was a vigorous national debate. And so he was caught in this dilemma, this ideological dilemma. The old guard says, slow down. The young people say, the pace is too slow. The second dilemma that faced the government was, for President Talbot, in my view, a personal dilemma. President Talbot's family was highly skilled and achievement-oriented. Or I should say is highly skilled and achievement-oriented. Many members of his family were astute business people. Long before the president acceded to the presidency, before Talbot acceded to the presidency, one of his brothers had become a successful entrepreneur. The president himself was a successful businessman. By 1975, the business holdings of the president and his family were enormous, and they were visible and had become an issue in the political debate. Family businesses included fishing and poultry enterprises, automobile and heavy equipment dealerships and services, light industries such as an aluminum frame and pots manufacturing business, a soap and detergent manufacturing business, a textile and uniform distributorship, a vast rubber plantation in Sinoe, and rice and oil palm producing businesses, including rice distributorships. And so that was part of the personal dilemma. But there was a second part to it. The Talbot family did not only have a substantial presence in the economy, it also had a substantial control of the government. The president's elder brother was president pro tempore of the Liberian Senate. His younger brother was a minister of finance, controlling the purse strings. The president's son was chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the House of Representatives. His father-in-law, the father-in-law of the president's younger brother, was the Chief Justice of the Republic of Liberia. The president's son-in-law or sons-in-law were Minister of Defense and later Minister of National Security and Commissioner of Immigration and Naturalization Service. So here was a substantial presence of a family network, not only in business, but in all three branches of government. President Talbot was a good man. He did many good things. But these dilemmas overwhelmed the system, particularly from the perspectives of those who sought change. Now, all of these dynamics were playing themselves out in an environment of economic decline. And let me give you some idea of the nature of the decline we're talking about. In the 1960s, as we said, there had been huge rises in the Liberian economy. Our rate of growth rivaled that of the most prosperous countries of the world. Our growth rate at some point were almost 10%. But it began to slow down significantly in the 1970s, such that unemployment began a steep rise. It rose to 23% in 1979, but in Monrovia particularly, unemployment reached 39%. The cost of living was mounting. Prices rose at an overall rate of 6% in 1977, 7% in 1978, and 14% in 1979. Now these are Ministry of Planning figures. And I must tell you, the Ministry of Planning during the period, since that ministry was organized, had kept really good statistics. And I think that is to its credit and the credit of all the good people who worked there. From the time it was established by Mr. Jimmy Weeks, to I think Dr. Bright, to Mr. David Neal, and others, subsequent others. It was a repository of very good financial, very good statistics, economic related statistics. Okay. Food prices rose in 1976 by 15%, and in 1978 also by 15%. It was estimated in 1974 that more than 3/4 of the households in Liberia earned less than $50 a month. It was also estimated by the Ministry of Planning that 50% of the household incomes of our country were being taken by 5% of the families. So that's the context, the economic context within which we find the pressure for change on the one hand and the resistance to change on the other hand. Now, what are some of the trigger events that came up gradually, leading to the crisis of 79 and 1980. The pressure for democratization had seen the ascendancy of several political and social movements. As I told you, there was Moja, there was PAL, there was the Revelation, and a number of groups. Needless to say, on the campuses, students became even more aware and formed student unions that paid attention to, were concerned about, and indeed advocated for change in our national governance arrangement. There was pressure, increased pressure for greater democratization, for opening up of political space. The government's response was not always positive. Liberia, unfortunately, we have a political culture, or we had in those days, and we still have a bit of it today, that promotes the view that government, especially the president, should not be seen yielding to pressure, responding to pressure. Policies and actions must always flow like blessings from the government, from the president. And this is a bad policy, a bad norm in our culture. Because government must be seen responding to the people. The people are supposed to be the ones who form the government. The government must be seen listening and responding. The leaders must not be seen as if they are omniscient and omnipotent and at their own will and desire and caprices flow benefits to people. That is why today I don't like the term deliverables, because it connotes this government delivering to people. Government and people should be in an interaction, responding to each other and together co-producing benefits. Not the supremacy of government, and then in our case, with the concentration of powers in the presidency, the supremacy of the president. That's why I like the fact that President Sirleaf has said repeatedly, she wants to dismantle the imperial presidency. That's extremely important. And so now let me give you maybe what might look like some kind of a chronology of some of the events moving into the crisis. Let's start with 1974. 1974. I've already mentioned the passage, the gambling bill. President Talbot proposed a gambling bill that gambling should be legalized in Liberia. It has since been legalized, clearly. But it was new then. And immediately there were a group of Liberians, including religious leaders, who did not like the idea. And so a citizens group was organized called Citizens of Liberia Against Gambling, COLAG. This group pressured the legislature so that the legislature could reject the bill. And as I told you, the Truitt Party government at the time insisted on party discipline. And those members of the party government that were in fact, of the party that were in the legislature were reined in. They were called in and pressured to vote for the passage of the bill. The bill went back. 6 members of the legislature voted against it, but that bill was passed. Promptly after passing it, the president vetoed it. Now, when the president vetoed it, he gave the same reasons for vetoing it that the 6 people who voted against it had given. So here was a case not only of demeaning the legislature, but of establishing presidential authority as if it should supersede everything and should remain immune to pressures. The second event I'd like to put to you, again happened in 1974, and it was the Albert Port trial. In September 1974, Albert Port had published a pamphlet called Gobbling Business. I need not tell you who Albert Port was. He died in 1986. For 50 years plus, he was a publicist, a man of conscience, and a constitutionalist. He was a fearless and courageous Liberian patriot. I deeply regret his passing and regret that today we do not have the counsel and the intervention of this legendary Liberian patriot. But in 1974, he published this, as he had been publishing over the years, keeping an eye on government and government officials. That pamphlet pointed to the business dealings of the president's brother, the Minister of Finance. Albert Port was sued by the president's brother for libel. A few demonstrations were organized in support and fundraising of the Albert Port defense, for the Albert Port defense. The Supreme Court banned demonstrations. The lower court carried on the case and brought Port down guilty. The case went on appeal to the Supreme Court in early 1975. While that process was pending, the Revelation published articles condemning the action of the lower court. The Supreme Court then banned the Revelation and fined its members $17,000 to be paid or to go to jail. On February 10th, 1975, a group called the Mothers of Monrovia, a group of middle-class women, including some of the relatives of the Revelation editors, organized a rally and demonstration in protest against the Supreme Court rulings. Meanwhile, I should tell you that in 1974, the government had pushed through legislation granting President Talbot emergency powers. That act by a legislature that was so easily bullied was roundly condemned by the religious leaders, Bishop George Brown of the Episcopal Church, the Reverend Tuomo Reeves, Bishop Michael Francis, and a lot others. So on the day of the Mothers of Monrovia demonstration, February 10, 1975, Konan Kaisu, now James Emmanuel Roberts, was traveling from Monrovia, from downtown Monrovia to Sinco in a car. He was stopped, pulled out of the car, arrested, and taken off to Belayala For younger folks, you may not know that Belayala was the most notorious of Liberian prisons. And this incident, the arrest of Kunakaiso, sent shock through the community. It sent terror through the ranks of those who opposed the government. And so they were quickly to assess what this means, to perhaps here evaluate the situation and to conclude that we have now entered a new era of terror and repression. And so the Albert Port case awaited the review by the Supreme Court, and the case ended when the Minister of Finance, Mr. Talbot, was unfortunately killed in a tragic plane crash. The third incident I'd like to put to you was the controversy surrounding the property clause for voting. Liberia had on its books, in its electoral laws, that a voter needed to own property in order to vote. Not just to hold office, but to exercise the franchise. You must own property. That was the law of the land in 1975. It was the law of the land even earlier. But I take 1975 because in that year there were presidential elections. And President Talbot was elected with a vote of slightly more than 800,000 of the electorate. At that time, the property clause was not enforced. 2 years later, in 1977, Bishop Benny Warner was elected Vice President of Liberia, and he too was elected by a vote that slightly exceeded 800,000. And on that occasion also, the property clause was not enforced. And by the way, Bishop George Brown, Bishop Michael Francis were among leaders, religious leaders, who roundly criticized Bishop Warner for accepting the vice presidency, while at the same time serving as Bishop of the United Methodist Church. This dragging of the church into politics considerably demeaned the impact that the Methodist Church, as part of the conscience of this society, could have played when Bishop Vice President Warner held reins in both church and state. So in early 1978, I announced my candidacy to become mayor of Monrovia. And I stressed at that time I would be running as an independent and not as a member of the True Whig Party. You may ask me why this intervention, but I can tell you this intervention was due to the fact that, given my training and experience at that time, I could see that coming down the road, by the year 1982, 1983, when general elections would be held, there would be a serious pressure for multi-party politics, and that the electoral system had better be ready at that time to respond with integrity to the evolving multi-party democracy that was at hand. My announcement was not an individual decision. It was a decision taken by the group of which I affiliated, Moja, and I'm proud of that. And we decided that we should put up a candidate, not as a Moja candidate, and it need not be a Moja person. Before my candidacy was announced, we had sought to find candidates in other people. We went around asking people, because the idea here was to begin now to address the legal issues that needed to be addressed so that we can avoid violence and a breakdown of our system come 1982, 1983, when elections, presidential elections, would be on hand. At this time, you must remember, the Progressive Alliance of Liberia had already announced its intention of organizing a political party and of contesting elections. So, in May 1978, there were legislative elections held, and the property clause was not enforced. It was about June, or around about that time, in 1978, that the government announced that in the ensuing mayoral elections, the property clause will be enforced. So you see the double standards in the making, the resistance to the process of change. These elections, the mayoral elections, were scheduled for November 13, 1979. And so we began a lot of negotiations, consultations, numerous meetings with the president, with the legislature, with the religious community, enlisting the support of everybody to ensure that this property clause would be removed. Why? Because it had never been enforced, but more importantly, because the era of democracy that Liberia faced in 1979, if it were to move forward, demanded that such archaic law be removed from the books. But that clause now was being used as a weapon to stifle democratic progress, to keep political space closed. And we were then determined, using the electoral process to widen and broaden democratic space. And so through the campaign for mayor and through advocacy to get the laws changed, on October 29, 1979, October 29, 1978, President Talbot called a meeting in which he invited the leadership of Moja, of which I was a part, of PAL, and of the Truic Party. He invited leading clergymen, and at that meeting, he explained that in his view, there was need for time so that the legislature could remove the property clause. We supported that decision to postpone the elections until June 1979 so that the property clause could be removed from the books. But events were then to take a different turn. because after this meeting with the president and the agreement to postpone the elections, some new developments took place. In March 1979, I'm sorry. Yeah, in March 1979. The Progressive Alliance of Liberia in March 1979, Moja celebrated its anniversary on March 21st at the Sports Commission. And at that meeting, the Progressive Alliance of Liberia, the leader of the Progressive Alliance of Liberia, announced that there would be a demonstration to oppose the price increase that was being considered in rice, in the sale of rice. And there are a number of developments that surrounded that flowed from that decision, and that indeed led to what we now call the rice riots. During that period, with the beginning of the mayor campaign, I tried then to keep some notes. And so after the riot, when the president appointed a commission to investigate what happened, the Brownell Commission, I was asked to make a presentation to that commission on the causes of the riot. I made a presentation to one of the committees of that commission, the Social and Political Committee. This was sometime in May 1979. I have here, Mr. Chairman, a copy of that presentation that I made on that occasion. I was able to get a hold of this copy, this presentation made almost 30 years ago, from Professor Elwood Dunn. I will submit this statement to your committee, and although it is a bit long, I would like to read it, because it gave you my perspective, 25 years ago or thereabouts, almost 30 years, 1979, March, 29 years ago, on those events. And I would ask that you check this out against the records of the commission. I have not changed a single word, even though there are one or two recommendations I made in this at that time as a young man that I may not really want to make today. And those, if you want to, we can discuss them. But let me read what I wrote 29 years ago to that committee. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, thank you very much for inviting me to present to you my views of the causes of the recent civil disturbance which took place in Monrovia on April 14. As you know, I am an assistant professor of political science at the University of Liberia, a founding member of MOJA, a founding member and current chairman of the Committee on Membership and Vigilance of the Movement for Justice in Africa, MOJA, and director of special projects, Susuku Incorporated. Responsibility for the civil disturbance has been placed at various times and in a multitude of ways on all of these organizations and institutions or some of their members. 7 of the men now imprisoned in connection with this development are members of MOJA, and 5 are students of the University of Liberia. One of the men held in prison for 2 weeks on a false charge of being a member of a Progressive Alliance of Liberia, and released only after painstaking efforts on the part of his relatives and associates to establish that he was not a member of PAL, is both a MOJA brother of mine and a colleague in the Department of Political Science at the University of Liberia. I am very pleased and proud to be a colleague of such an honest and dedicated patriot as Dr. H. Boima Fambule Jr. You will also recall that Mr. Dew Twangle Mason, chairman of the Committee on Research and Information of MOJA and director of research and training of Susuku Incorporated, was also arrested and imprisoned. Mason's arrest took place at a time when he was participating in a government-organized seminar in Sinoe for the training of Peace Corps volunteers. My relationship with Mr. Mason is long-standing, and I'm very pleased and proud to be his colleague and associate. I have gone to such length to establish my association with these groups and individuals to stress that the activities of these individuals and organizations are fully known to me, and as such my testimony to you will provide insights as to their dedication to participation in the national recovery and reconstruction process. Both Susuku Incorporated and the Movement for Justice in Africa have written and submitted to the President of Liberia detailed proposals on several aspects of a possible strategy for national reconstruction. These organizations stand ever ready to participate in the efforts towards national reconstruction. Both organizations await reaction from the government. In addressing the issue at hand, permit me, Mr. Chairman, to draw a distinction, though some may think an artificial one, between the immediate cause of the civil disturbance of April 14 and the general and fundamental causes. This is not to suggest that the immediate bears no relationship to the general and systemic. In fact, to the contrary, it is a one-shot traumatic manifestation of deep-seated systemic irregularities. To be blunt and to the point, the immediate cause of the civil disturbance was a faulty series of decision-making on the part of the government concerning the critical commodity of rice. I say this in full knowledge of the official account of the incident as published by the Ministry of Information and Cultural Affairs and Tourism, with deference to the public posture assumed by government. The first in the series of wrong decisions made by the government was the decision to postpone a decision on the all-important question of a possible increase in the price of rice. According to official statements, the government the question of a possible increase in the price of rice was first introduced in 1977. Government ruled against it. The Minister of Agriculture reintroduced the issue in her annual report in 1978. This time it was being taken as a viable option. In early February, the mass media began floating the idea as if to prepare the public for an eventual increase. At this point, the government had an unusual opportunity to sample public opinion on the issue. Public reaction was swift, strong, and negative. One would have thought that the issue would have been dropped or the government would have immediately found other ways to assist the producers. After all, the Liberian government has established the machinery and mobilized resources to increase productivity and returns to rubber farmers and to coffee and cocoa producers. In all candor, public outcry against the possible increase in the price of rice was not unfair. Government statistics show that the average income of an urban worker is $80 per month. Even at the current price of $22 a 100-pound bag of rice, a non-substitutable item in the Liberian diet, consumes about 28% of the monthly wages of an urban worker. Since many urban workers cannot afford such enormous outlay at one time, they are forced to buy rice at a retail rate and thus spend much more, as much as 35 to 45% of their wages on an incremental basis for rice, a single and critical commodity. After the purchasing of rice and the payment of rent, which again is exorbitant, the urban worker would have spent close to 95% of his wages if he would not have already spent his full wages and begun crediting against the next month's pay period. And so even at current prices, the urban worker totters on the brink of survival, living from month to month, largely in a situation of chance. Even at more affluent levels, with the extended family as an entrenched institution, a number of semi-affluent homes consume more than a single bag of rice per month. At $22 per bag, the cost of rice is a strain even for people at such levels. I'm trying to make 2 points here, Mr. Chairman. First, given these realities, the question of a possible increase in the price of rice should not have even been entertained. Not only did government entertain the question, it was in the process of giving it very serious consideration. The second point here is that given these realities, any group, the Association of Liberian Morons, Amalgamated Infants Incorporated, if there are any such groups, could have mobilized the Liberian people to bring pressure on government not to increase the price of rice. By considering such an increase and by further permitting a decision to linger, the government provided the fuel to ignite a fire. No conspiracy was needed. No acts of treason needed to be contemplated. And even if the so-called wicked, and people were being called wicked at the time, used this development for their selfish designs, was it not the government who created the conditions and nurtured the issues that could be used? Please ponder this. When the Progressive Alliance of Liberia announced its demonstration, one would have thought that the government would have taken swift action to defuse the issue. Government could have taken one of two wholesome options. It could have announced a decision not to increase the price of rice, or it could have permitted the demonstration so as to get a true picture of public opinion. In permitting the demonstration, government could have extended police protection to the demonstrators, delineated routes to be taken, and put the responsibility of ensuring that demonstrators respect the rights of others on the leadership of the demonstration. Instead, the government took a second wrong decision, a decision to ban the demonstration and to advertise that ban over radio. A brief informal survey which I had conducted since I received your invitation, shows that a very large number of people who were preparing to attend the demonstration, had it taken place, heard about the demonstration through the radio broadcast banning it. In other words, the decision to ban the demonstration was interpreted as an indication that the government did not want to fathom the extent of popular opinion, and as if to add salt to a wound, the advertised threat contained in the broadcast was seen as government's determination to suffocate popular opinion of the people with the massive use of force. Thus, the government had not only provided the fuel, but had now doused an explosive situation with the fuel. The third wrong decision made by the government was indeed the massive use of force. The deployment of large contingents of soldiers and police armed with tear gas, batons, and above all, live and fatal bullets, and the decision to shoot into unarmed, unorganized, and frustration-laden crowds of poor people. Common sense could tell us that, and a social scientist would confirm, that any economic group, such as a crowd, which was gathered around the city to attend the demonstration, being frustrated by the denial of a desired and much needed opportunity to express a view, and greatly endangered by the killing of scores of its members, will inevitably turn to rioting and looting and to every other violent method of expression available to it. And so the suggestion that the rioting and looting could not have been done by Liberians and that the whole episode was un-Liberian seemed to imply that Liberians are a different set of people incapable of responding as social and political beings to extraneous social and political conditions. It is not strange that the rioting and looting only began after shots were fired by the police and people killed. In this act, the government had finally lit the match which caused the explosion. This was its third erroneous decision. Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen of the committee, I perceive one fundamental attitude or assumption on the part of government which underlies all of its errors in dealing with the situation. This basic assumption is that government, the custodian of the collective power and guardian of the supreme interests of the people, ought not to be pressured by the people or any segment of them. That government makes its decision in its own time, and that any attempt to pressure government is a villainous challenge to the authority of the state, to the solemn responsibility of government, and constitutes, quote, a diabolical and satanic act of treason. These are words used quite frequently during that time in the newspaper and by officials. This is my aside. A diabolical and satanic act of treason calculated to overthrow constituted authority. Such arrogance of power is a dangerous posture. It implies that government and not the people is the basis of sovereignty. It creates needless antagonisms between the people and their leaders and nurtures a groundswell of pent-up disgruntlement which in time seeks escape through avenues which are disruptive to the body politic. I submit, Mr. Chairman, that the application of pressure to government is a healthy method of political intercourse in all political systems, no matter the ideological complexion. The more resilient government becomes to the pressures of the people, the more it develops its own raison d'etre. A government that requires massive and constant pressure of support, massive and constant measures of support must simultaneously provide possibilities for equally massive and constant measures of request and demands. This is what the democratic process is all about, and this is the pattern through which emerging Liberian social and political reality, attended as it is by growing awareness and national consciousness, awakened largely by the Liberian leaders themselves, this is how change has become inevitable. It cannot be encouraged and muscled at the same time. The Liberian people cannot be called upon to be totally involved, self-reliant, and to move from mat to mattresses, while the process of involvement remains circumscribed, the mechanism for self-reliance remains severely conditioned, and the mattress out of reach. These, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen of the committee, are the issues of the immediate cause of the civil disturbance and as I see them. They show why the Progressive Alliance could seize an opportunity to exploit an unpopular issue created by government, and why students of the University of Liberia, acting as conscience of society, had no alternative but to oppose the increase in the price of rice. Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen of the committee, what I have thus far done is to narrate to you my interpretation of the immediate causes of the April 14 civil disturbance. What I will now attempt, with your indulgence, is to employ some degree of insight and with the benefit of hindsight to explain some of the social, economic, and political policies and practices of our society to bring the more fundamental causes of this disturbance into the fore. I submit that there are some serious economic conditions which have contributed substantially to the April 14 development. Most of these are known to the government because data exposing them have not only been made available by the government, but have been widely used by government officials, even by the president himself. It is known that 90% of Liberians live at subsistence levels or very close to subsistence levels, that real wages across the economic spectrum has declined considerably in this decade, that for agriculture and mine workers, this decline in real wages has been as sharp as 40% and above, and 40% and above since 1971, that unemployment in urban Liberia is as high as in the 30s, and expect to get worse by 1982, when 75,000 additional jobs will need to be generated by our economy, which will only be able to generate 25,000 additional jobs. That inflation runs well in excess of 15%, all of which is not due to international causes, but substantially to local profiteering and fat skimming, and that Monrovia's average income of $80 per month is woefully inadequate to meet the minimum survival costs of a family of four, estimated at $113 a month. These are only a few of the statistical indices of poverty in Liberia. If we look at the economic program which over the last 4 years have been designed to combat mass poverty, we find their performance disappointing and their results negligible. 3 of the programs which have been designed to combat mass poverty have been the Integrated Rural Development Program, the low-cost housing, and the restructuring of the tax system. I submit, Mr. Chairman, that these programs have not accrued the desired results. Since 1976, the government has been implementing an Integrated Rural Development Program. Results of this experiment are still at best inconclusive. Cooperatives, the bedrock of this approach, are still tottering on the brink of survival where they still exist. 80% of rural small farmers remain largely unaffected, and increase in the production of rice increases in the production of rice have not been substantial enough to reduce the even spiraling increase in rice importation. The benefits, if any, which have developed from our integrated rural development schemes have not been sufficiently attractive to stem the intensifying drift from rural Liberia to urban Liberia. They have not been substantial enough to consolidate rural societies. After 4 years of experimentation, our rural development scheme still remains timid. The housing scheme, which began 6 years ago to provide shelter for low-income earners, has also been disappointing in its results. Since 1973, at least 5 housing projects have been completed or initiated: the Amical Cabral, Stephen Talbot, E.J. Goodrich, New Georgia, and Matadi. Only the New Georgia project has been designed to actually cater to low-income earners. Furthermore, the impact of the 180 units at New Georgia will remain negligible. The pressing problem of urban housing has not been fully studied and is not being adequately addressed. No formula has been found to the question of rural housing, a problem which has so far been ignored if the unsuccessful attempt at JOA is to be excused. The revised tax scheme, which was meant to relieve the burden of the poor and exact more from the wealthy, has not succeeded. No sooner has the austerity tax been lifted from urban low-income earners than demanding political and social contributions were slapped on. As far as the rural poor are concerned, the HOT and development tax still maintain their stranglehold, consuming at least half of the average rural income. In addition to these programs, there are some serious socio-economic problems attending the ownership and use of land and labor relationships in Liberia. We are gradually seeing the isolation of rural villages and the enclosing of hitherto rural farmland by urban-based gentlemen farmers, a budding rural elite, and by private concessions. The land is indeed changing hands, moving from the hands of the many to the hands of the few. This is a potentially explosive situation. Labor relations is deteriorating. Trade unions no longer represent the legitimate aspirations of their members, and thus a wave of disaffection, of disaffiliation from the major unions is being witnessed. Cases of illegal dismissals are soaring, and effective avenues for redress are closing. Labor is constantly getting restless due to lack of close attention to its problems. At the bedrock of these economic problems is our political situation. The decisions which control the Liberian economy and all other aspects of life in Liberia and any other country for that matter are largely made in the political process. When we examine the Liberian political process, we find certain major problems. One of the political developments for which the present administration deserves the greatest of credits is the restoration of certain basic liberties. Freedom of speech is a hallmark of the Talbot administration. The presentation of this frank and candid assessment of the Liberian society is itself a testimony to the degree of freedom of expression permitted by this administration. However, the consequences of freedom of speech and the requisite attendant political developments have not been accommodated by the political process. Freedom of speech is not an end in itself, but an instrument to democratize decision-making. This, unfortunately, has not been achieved. The Liberian decision-making process still remains overly centralized, personalized, and ad hoc. Even the most casual of observers will note that in the Liberian political process, there are very few decision-makers, and that most matters, sometimes the most routine, have to be resolved at the highest levels of decision-making. The sluggishness of the Liberian democracy is in part a consequence of the over-centralization. Patterns of political recruitment, that is, selection of portfolio, have not always been guided by criteria of competence, productivity, and personal suitability. As a result, there are several square pegs in round holes. Corruption and nepotism abound. In the past, the decision-making process was characterized by the absence of planning. While this problem has been resolved, there now exists a situation in which plans are not permitted to experience full execution. Every major social and economic plan of the Liberian government, from such sectoral plans as those concerning agriculture and education to the National Socio-Economic Development Plan, has found itself either rendered unimplementable or substantially unfulfilled because of the massive interference of ad hoc decisions which have taken precedence over established priority over them. Turning to the relationship between the people and their political institutions, we find a gulf. Popular participation in the selection of political leaders is too circumscribed. There is a critical need for the democratization of the selection process, for the participation of the people in the selection of their leaders, and in making the decisions which affect their lives. The mass media has contributed substantially to the over-centralization of decision-making and to the greater need for ad hoc decision-making in contrast to planned decision-making. The media has overly exposed the president, presenting him as the Superman, all-powerful and omniscient. Its ever-present cameras and microphones have demanded crowd-pleasing decisions every time the president speaks. But one of the greater disservices of the mass media, which stems from overexposure, is the reduction of the credibility of government pronouncements. Because the media have been oriented to heaping praises and portraying a demigod-like image of the president and the infallibility of government in a society in which both the president and government are known to be, the presidency and the government are known to be occupied by fallible men, where education and work experience have heightened consciousness, the media have succeeded in creating an erosion of the credibility of government. It has exaggerated both government's capacity and willingness to deliver. Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen of the committee, permit me to look briefly at one of the last segments of our society. I refer to the social norms and practices of our society which further widen the chasm between the haves and have-nots and form the basis for serious social conflict. Socially, Liberia constitutes two worlds. The one is the world of the haves, which is characterized by affluence and ostentatious lifestyle. The symbol and trappings of wealth and the good life are brazenly flaunted. This is the world of Cadillacs, Jaguars, and Mercedes-Benzes, a world of striped three-piece suits, sprawling mansions, and video recording sets. At that time, videos were news. Liberians of this world are among the most suave, cosmopolitan, and jet-setting types of Africa, more in tune with the fashions of New York, Paris, and London, and more comfortable with the trappings of Western luxury living than any other group of socialites in Africa. Existing side by side with this luxury group and being shamelessly exploited by it are the poor people of Liberia, parched in the wretchedness of poverty, dazzled by the endless possibilities available to the affluent, languishing in the squalor of the city and the harshness and austerity of rural villages. The Ministry of Planning and Economic Affairs has documented this. It has posited that in Liberia, less than 4% of the people own 60% of the wealth. It is such hoarding and vaunting of wealth not enough provocation to awaken the poor to restlessness? Should a man who is hardly able to pay 50 cents for one smoked fish and 25% for a cup of rice look with pleasure and delight on another who entertains his friends at regular buffet meals at $25 a head? And so, Mr. Chairman, I believe it is imperative that in a society like ours, where ownership of the resources is so skewed in favor of the few, where opportunities are abundant in some quarters and very scarce in others, where the paths to wealth rest on the shoulders of the poor, and where careless vaunting of wealth is the order of the day, it is imperative that this process be checked, that the appropriate policies be implemented to correct this awkward and ugly situation. Several areas have been discussed, and numerous developments in the Liberian society have led to the developments of April 14, and they have been touched upon. A bleak picture has been painted. To do otherwise would be dishonest. Now, where do we go from here? I am of the view, Mr. Chairman, that Liberia has to chart a new course which should be fundamentally different from our current course. Our economic problems and the plight of our urban and rural poor can only be remedied if a decision-making framework based on mass participation is adopted. A major first step is already being prepared. It is contained in the working documents of the Rural Development Task Force headed by Dr. Cyril Bright. The bottom-up approach which this proposal promises seeks to organize national decisions, making political and economic participation from the levels of the towns and villages of rural Liberia to the cities and towns of urban Liberia to the national level. This framework should see the true democratization of Liberian society and the essence of total involvement. It would also be very necessary for this nation to devise a code of conduct for public officials where conflict of interest will be removed and where an individual's public office will not be used as the base for greater accumulation, where corruption and nepotism can be prevented. It is also important to restructure the process of recruitment to public office. There is need for the meaningful participation of the people in the selection of their legislators, superintendents, chiefs, and presidents. The present party caucus system is inherently closed, blatantly unfair, and mechanically controlled from the top. The land question needs to be addressed. It is time that a broad-based land reform program be undertaken where the limits can be placed on the amount of land to be owned by any one person, and the large numbers of technically landless, especially of rural areas, can be assured of land ownership. The rice issue should be carefully studied, and the production of rice to feed our people should become a national priority, for which there should be a national mobilization effort. The structure of wages should be examined and a national policy instituted to ensure minimum wages remain compatible with cost of living. The strategy for economic development should be tailored so that employment-generating economic activities could dominate the economy. Full employment and practices should be instituted by the government. Industrial relations must be seriously improved, and incentives such as partial ownership of industry should be offered workers. All workers, especially agriculture workers, should have the unencumbered right of association as they see fit. The law or laws of Liberia, especially the stringent shackles on strikes, should be reviewed, and the conditions for full expression on the part of workers should be created. Hot and development taxes should be abolished in rural Liberia. The emphasis on vocational and technical education should be quadrupled. A greater emphasis in this respect should be put on non-formal training. Regarding the natural resources of the state, all such resources should be effectively owned by the state. A new look should be taken at the conditions of resource exploration, and greater national control should be exerted. With the institution of proper training and technical and management skills, Liberians should be in a position to exercise effective control over the natural resources. A new and healthy respect for the poor should be encouraged through policies and practices of government. The entire orientation of government should be in favor of the interests of the masses of the Liberian people who are poor. A prerequisite to any attempt at national reconstruction has to begin with the complete resolution of the April 14 civil disturbance. The first step that should be taken by government toward this end is the institution of general and total amnesty for all those currently charged and imprisoned in connection with the incident. This will constitute an enormous act of goodwill and reconciliation. There are also practical benefits in general amnesty. The Liberian government has usually boasted that there are no political prisoners in Liberia. This boast cannot be made at this time, and this is a critical time when, in the wake of the OAU 7-9, the international press is focusing penetratingly on Liberia. Already, Liberia is faring very badly in the international press since the April 14 development. The president himself will be seriously compromised as a peacemaker and chairman of the OAU if the issues of April 14 are not completely resolved. How can international recognition and respectability come to an OAU chairman who wields emergency powers and holds political prisoners? What human rights examples can we speak of? The granting of general and total amnesty will be immediately followed by a campaign of national mobilization of young people for the successful hosting of the 1979 OAU Summit Conference. The proposal put forward by the Movement for Justice in Africa could in many ways serve as a model for undertaking a general amnesty and mobilization for the OAU conference. The University of Liberia at this point could be crucial in the mobilization campaign. Another important issue that needs full consideration is the actual incidents of April 14. People should be able to learn from their mistakes. A whitewashed job can teach no honest lesson. It is important that a true and accurate account of the development of April 14 be taken. Who ordered the police to shoot to kill? Why were they ordered to shoot to kill? What role did the Liberian National Guard really play? How many people were actually killed? Who were they? What kind of bullets were used? Besides these questions, it is important to investigate the insanity displayed by many government officials, especially some county superintendents, who went on a rampage, rounding up and detaining innocent people. The situations in Grand Jede and Nimba counties demand serious special attention. Hundreds of people in these two counties are harassed and imprisoned. New checkpoints were set up by local authorities, and passengers traveling through these counties were sometimes detained for as long as 8 to 10 hours, and their properties taken away from them. There is also the case of the Reverend Dr. Nya Tayo, whose house in Gompa City, Ganta, was ransacked by Superintendent Domba's men. Tayo was pursued into Guinea by a posse constituted by the local officials of Nimba. Nothing is known of his whereabouts. An investigation into this matter is urgent. The University of Liberia, the nation's highest institution of learning, is another important issue for close consideration. The question is, what role does the government expect of the University of Liberia? Is the university expected to be a center of learning, of critical thinking, and the conscience of the society, as universities are in most societies? Or should the University of Liberia be considered yet another government bureaucracy, perhaps a Ministry of Higher Education? This issue needs resolution. Finally, Mr. Chairman, we need to remind ourselves that history has put us all on trial. President Talbot appointed your commission and mandated it to undertake a full and authentic investigation. You, in fulfillment of your mandate, have invited frank and candid testimonies from the broad masses of the Liberian people. We expect that your commission will prepare a report reflective of the seriousness of the serious issues which are raised with you. The President also promised to implement your report. The public and history expect him to keep his word. Thank you very much. This was my submission. It's been at length. I wanted to read this because I wanted to give you a flavor of the tenor of the times, of the issues that were at stake, of the mode and the pulse of the people, especially people like me, how we saw the issues. I must say to you that on some of those recommendations, I have since changed my mind. I don't think state ownership of all the land is a good idea. There is wisdom, I think, in years. And so for me, this document, I thought to put it forward to you because I think it was important to give you some ideas of how we saw the trigger factors surrounding the war. Now, let me fast forward and go to some of the issues, some of the related issues surrounding the coup. Now, after the OAU meeting in 1979, of course, it was as if this country, after the mayor contest, took a sort of a collective break from the kind of intense political activities that were going on to see the OAU through. And I think it's to the credit of all Liberians, and I think we have it in us when faced with a situation where we are all called upon to collectively show our best foot, as we do when there's a football game. No matter where we are, we rally. And this is a good thing to begin to work on. So we all rallied to get the OAU to make it successful. But after the OAU, we returned to the process of trying to democratize the Liberian society and engaging each other in a process that we hope would have gotten us a more democratic system. Some of the events that took place thereafter had some unfortunate consequences as a result of the government's reaction to them. For example, in March of 1980, the Progressive People's Party, that had now been registered, published what they call a declaration of intent. In that statement, they outlined the failings of the government, and they called for the resignation of the president and vice president. The response of the government was, after back and forth, was indeed to arrest and detain the leaders, and to detain with them many leading sympathizers of the PPP. The press went hysterical on the diabolical plot and all of that, whipping flames of passion. And rumors began to circulate that the leaders of PPP and their leading sympathizers would be tried and executed. These rumors were rife across this country. Unfortunately, the government did not take a move to quell them. I think this was a fatal mistake. And I'm saying this with the benefit of hindsight.